Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little more toothy, and not in a good way. We're diving into the gruesome, nerve-rattling world of medieval dentistry. A time when teeth were pulled with iron pliers, everyone had halitosis, and anesthesia was just a strong prayer and a mug of ale. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you've ever dreaded a trip to the dentist, count your blessings, because back in medieval Europe, your dentist was probably also your local blacksmith, and your checkup came with a side of screaming. Your story as a medieval dentist doesn't start with inspiration. It starts with stench. You're born in a one-room hovel with a dirt floor, a thatched roof, and a family who believes bad breath is simply part of being alive. No one brushes their teeth, no one has a toothbrush. And soap? That's for fancy nobles and monks with skin conditions. As a baby, you gnaw on hard bread crusts and dried roots because that's what's available. Teething isn't helped with chilled rings. It's soothed with beer-soaked rags and whispered prayers. Everyone assumes crying means you're growing stronger. In reality, your gums are inflamed, and your first baby tooth will likely rot before it gets the chance to fall out naturally. By age 5, you've already seen a grown man spit out a molar during dinner and keep chewing. Your grandmother stores her pulled teeth in a pouch, for luck, and your father's smile resembles a crumbling graveyard. No one's concerned. This is normal. And then there's the breath. Oh, the breath. Every adult smells like a cave full of old cheese and regrets. Your friends don't notice because they smell the same. You, however, have a sensitive nose, unlucky for you, but the first sign that you might be destined for dentistry. At age 7, you watch the local blacksmith pull a villager's tooth with tongs meant for horseshoes. The man screams, bleeds, and thanks him afterward. You ask questions. Too many. So they hand you the rag, tell you to mop the blood, and suddenly, you're the assistant. There's no ceremony, no oath, no official title. But that day, your path is sealed. You're the child who isn't afraid of mouths. The boy who doesn't faint at blood. The one who knows how to boil pliers and bite back nausea. Congratulations. You're now the unofficial apprentice to the village's least glamorous profession. Your toys are forceps. Your lessons involve pain. And your playmates are molars dropped into bowls with a dull clink. You don't dream of being a knight or a bard or even a scribe. You dream of not flinching next time someone screams in your face. And so begins your journey. Not with a white coat, but with a blood-stained apron and a very unfortunate destiny. Let's get one thing straight. Dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was a myth, and if it ever existed, it died screaming sometime around the 6th century. You, the future village tooth yanker, grow up in a world where people clean their teeth with, well, nothing. If they're fancy, and we're talking monastery-level fancy, they might chew on twigs or rinse with wine. But most people, they just let nature take its course. And nature is not kind to molars. There's no toothpaste, no floss, and no idea that sugar might be bad for enamel. Mostly because enamel isn't a word anyone's heard of. The only thing sweet peasants consume regularly is misery, though nobles do enjoy the occasional honey-glazed disaster that accelerates mouth rot with regal flair. You, growing up with an eye for teeth, begin to notice a pattern. Everyone's breath smells like something died in their mouth and brought friends. Halitosis isn't a condition, it's a fact of life. You learn to speak from a distance. You instinctively breathe through your mouth, which, ironically, only makes your own smell worse. Children lose teeth young, not from age, but from accidents, infections, or chewing on rocks hidden in bread. By age 10, most people already have 2 or 3 ghost teeth, holes where something used to live. People accept this like they accept mud on their shoes or fleas in their bedding. There are herbal remedies, of course, You might chew mint or rinse with vinegar if you can afford it. But mostly, tooth care consists of hoping the pain goes away before it spreads to your jaw and kills you. And no one talks about the gums. Gums are just red, swollen meat that bleed when touched. And that's fine, apparently. The idea of brushing them gently with a soft, bristled brush would have sounded like witchcraft. As a budding medieval dentist, you begin cataloging this horror with fascination. You poke teeth with sticks. You learn the difference between wiggly but alive and dead but hanging on. And when someone asks what you want to be when you grow up, you say, someone who makes the screaming stop. Because in your world, there are only two kinds of smiles, the toothless and the soon-to-be. So how does one become a medieval dentist? Simple, you don't. There's no medical university, no dental license, no board exams. You learn by watching people suffer, and the best way to do that is by working under the most hands-on man in town, the barber surgeon. He's not a doctor, he's a multi-tool with blood on his sleeves. He trims beards, lances boils, sets broken bones, and amputates gangrenous limbs between breakfast and lunch. Naturally, he also pulls teeth. Because why not? And now, you're his apprentice. You sweep the floor. You hold down screaming patients. You fetch boiling water, not to clean tools, just to look impressive. Your first week you witness a leg amputation with a dull saw and a leather strap as anesthesia. You faint twice. But by week 2, you're holding a torch. By week 3, you're helping steady heads while your mentor yanks molars with blacksmith tongs. You ask too many questions, which means you're promoted to cleanup duty. Blood, pus, teeth. Your mentor is a practical man. If it's loose, pull it, he says. If it's black, pull it. If they scream, pull it faster. He teaches you that a quick extraction is better than a clean one. That infection is God's decision, not yours. And that you'll get paid more if you pretend to pray first. There's no textbook. Just instinct, superstition, and repetition. You learn to recognize which tooth will come out with a twist, and which one will snap in half and leave you with a sobbing peasant and a pair of broken pliers. When things go wrong, you learn the backup plan. Blame demons, blame diet, or, in emergencies, blame the stars. Astrology is surprisingly popular in medical theory, especially when the abscess can't be drained and your patient starts foaming at the mouth. Sometimes you help with battlefield injuries. Sometimes you assist with leeches. But your mentor always makes sure you're there for tooth days. Because as he puts it, nothing humbles a man like bleeding from the face. And slowly, you learn. Through blood, through screams, through trial and terror. You're not a healer. Not yet. But you're becoming something far more essential in the medieval world. A man who can make the pain go away. For a price. If you're expecting a tray of gleaming instruments, lined with surgical precision, you're thinking way too modern. A medieval dentist's toolkit looks like something confiscated from a dungeon. And you? You're learning to use every single piece. First, the pliers. Thick, rusted, heavy. Not made for dentistry, but for horseshoes, meat hooks, and stubborn nails. The handle smells of old sweat and iron. The grip. Questionable. But if it clamps down on something and pulls, it's considered effective. Then comes the tooth key. A twisted little crank designed to twist a tooth sideways until it pops loose. It rarely works the first time. Usually, it breaks the tooth in half, which is followed by you frantically digging out the root, while your patient sobs into a burlap sleeve. You have hooks and scrapers too. One looks like a shepherd's crook, perfect for snagging stubborn fragments. Another resembles a sharpened spoon, used to scoop out abscesses and pack them with moldy bread or ashes. Sterile? Absolutely not. There's also the mallet, yes, a mallet, for when the pliers fail and you need a bit of persuasion. You hold the tool against the tooth and give it a good tap. If your aim is true, the tooth pops. If not, well, the jaw might shift a little. The instruments aren't labeled. Some were once used for animal care. Others might have been fishing tools in a past life. You inherit most of them from the barber surgeon's late mentor. Tools he inherited from his mentor, and so on. One has a notch carved into the handle. It's either a maker's mark or someone's tally of fatalities. Cleaning is optional. Sometimes they're wiped with a cloth. Occasionally, passed through a flame, not to sterilize, but to add drama. Bloodstains are considered seasoning. Your job is to keep the tools organized, cleanish, and ready at a moment's notice. When someone walks in clutching their jaw, the last thing they want is delay. They want you to pull something. Quickly. And without asking too many questions. These aren't instruments of healing. They're weapons of mercy. And in your hands, they'll decide whether a man walks out smiling or never walks out again. In the medieval world, dental science didn't exist. But theories? Oh, they had plenty. Tooth pain wasn't caused by bacteria or decay. No one knew what plaque was, and enamel might as well have been a type of prayer. So what did people believe caused those throbbing, pus-filled, jaw-splitting toothaches? Worms. Tiny, evil, invisible worms. Yes, toothworms. These mythical little beasts were said to burrow into your molars and chew away, day and night, like termites in a timber beam. If your tooth ached, it meant the worm was hungry. If it cracked in half, the worm had finished its meal. As a budding dentist, you're taught to look serious while nodding wisely when someone asks, "Is it the worm again, master?" And you say yes, because it always is. Of course, there's also the religious angle. Some say tooth pain is punishment from God for lying, for vanity, or for eating too much honeyed bread. Your job? To remove the sinful tooth, as if you're exorcising a demon, with pliers. Patients often ask you to pray before an extraction. You oblige, mostly to calm them down, and maybe a little because you're afraid too. After all, you've seen infections travel to the neck and kill a man in days. Surely the gods are involved, right? But the most popular belief, and the one your mentor swears by, is that if you place a roasted onion next to the aching tooth, the worm will crawl out. Of course, all you ever see is steam and tears. No worms, but the patient believes it. Placebo magic and onion breath, a medieval double cure. You even learn a few worm-charming rituals. One involves whispering to the tooth, threatening the worm. Another includes heating a mixture of wax, herbs, and goat fat, then dripping it near the gums to smoke the worm out. Spoiler, it never works. Eventually, you come to accept the truth. Not about worms, but about belief. People want a reason for their pain, even if it's absurd. It's easier to picture a hungry worm than confront the reality of rot, disease, and death. And so, you carry on. Healer, priest, pest control. Just another day in the world of medieval mouth monsters. You've watched your mentor yank dozens of teeth from wailing villagers. You've held down the heads, passed the tools, and cleaned up the mess afterward. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for the first time you're handed the pliers. The patient is a middle-aged farmer named Edric. His tooth has been aching for a week. His wife says he hasn't slept, eaten, or prayed. Today he's desperate enough to let a teenager yank it out. You try not to tremble as your mentor steps back and nods. "Go on," he says, arms crossed, apron stained. "Time to earn your fingers." Edric sits on a stool, knuckles white, eyes wild. You mutter something that might be a prayer. He responds with something that might be his last words. You find the tooth. A molar, black and cracked, with swollen gums that look ready to explode. You position the forceps, hands slick with sweat. Edric tenses. On 3, you whisper, 1. And on 2, you twist. This is what you were taught. Don't wait for 3. It's mercy. Sort of. The tooth doesn't move. Edric screams like he's being skinned alive because, well, he sort of is. You adjust your grip, push down harder. You hear a sickening crack, and for a moment you think you've done it, until half the tooth comes out, and the rest stays buried like a jagged little dagger. Your mentor sighs. Keep going. The next few minutes are a blur of blood, curses, twisting metal, and panic. You finally wrench out the last fragment, nearly falling backward with the force. Edric slumps forward, face pale, mouth flooding with red. You've done it. Your hands are shaking. Your apron looks like you've murdered a pig. And yet, Edric is alive. Sobbing, sure, but grateful in that dazed, pain-shocked way that only a medieval peasant can be. You clean the wound with wine, pack it with herbs, and wrap his head. He thanks you with a bloody smile. You try not to cry or vomit. Maybe both. Later, your mentor slaps your back. Not bad, he says. You only cracked the jaw a little. You sleep that night with the tooth in your pocket. Your first trophy, your first scar. Once you've pulled a few teeth, you start to notice something that never goes away. Not in the workroom, not on your clothes, not even when you dream. It's the smell. At first it creeps up on you, a faint sourness in the air. You assume it's the stew boiling next door, or maybe your mentor's feet. But then you realize it's coming from mouths. Rotting teeth have their own stench, a gag-inducing cocktail of pus, blood, fermented food, and the unmistakable tang of necrotic flesh. Every time a patient opens wide, it hits you like a wall, and it stays with you. It soaks into your apron, your hair, your fingernails. You start to notice other things too. The smell of fear. It's real, sharp and metallic, especially when your patient is sweating through their tunic, eyes darting, knuckles white on the arms of the chair. Fear makes people stink in a very particular way. It mixes with the tooth rot, the garlic breath, the damp wool, and the faint aroma of hopelessness. No candle or herb bundle can cut through it. You stop trying. You also start keeping track of how many people pass out before the pliers even touch their mouth. You learn to catch heads before they fall. You get good at predicting who will scream, who will faint, and who will try to run. You have a rope for that now. Standard practice. Sometimes, the rot is so advanced, the tooth crumbles under your tool like moldy bread. What comes out isn't a tooth. It's a memory of one, blackened and soft, a fragment of a past meal and a future infection. You try not to breathe too deeply, but it's no use. The smell is part of you now. You leave the workshop, and people instinctively take a step back. Children cry when you pass. You've become an olfactory omen. One day, a merchant you helped weeks ago walks past you in the market. He nods politely, then holds a cloth over his nose. You're used to it. Because in this life, you don't just carry tools and bandages. You carry the scent of every open mouth you've ever reached into. And there are many more to come. By now, you've stopped seeing mouths as parts of people. You see them as battlefields, and you're sent in after the war. Every patient who sits in your chair carries a story between their lips, and it's always written in rot, blood, and broken enamel. Their mouths are disasters, caves of blackened stumps, cracked molars, exposed nerves, and gums that look like overripe fruit. Some teeth lean sideways, clinging to their neighbors like drunken soldiers. Others stand jagged and alone, yellow with age and soft to the touch. And beneath them, the gums are swollen red or gray with decay. You've even seen maggots, and not just once. You don't ask questions anymore. You just pry it open and assess the damage. There are teeth that wiggle when the patient breathes, others that explode into fragments the moment your tool touches them. You've seen mouths where not a single tooth remains intact, just roots poking through pus-filled craters. And then there's the infections. Sweet heavens. Boils beneath the tongue, cysts behind the molars, entire jaws that pulse with every heartbeat. You once drained a pocket of pus the size of a walnut. The man thanked you through tears. That was a good day. You work fast. Not for efficiency, but because the longer you look, the worse it gets. These aren't dental visits. They're triage sessions. You don't fix. You remove, scrape, and pray. You keep a bucket for discarded teeth. It fills by midday. The smell hits before the weight does. You begin to recognize people by their mouths alone. Ah, yes. the blacksmith with the abscess under his tongue, the baker whose gums bleed when he blinks, the widow with the 7 remaining roots all pointing in different directions. It's become your normal. You try to stay detached, but every so often, someone leans back, opens wide, and what you see sends a chill down your spine. Not because it's worse than usual, but because you recognize it in yourself. That back molar throbbing at night, it looks familiar. You're not just the healer of ruined mouths anymore. You're a ticking jaw in your own chair. By now, you've stopped flinching at screams. In fact, you barely notice them. They're the soundtrack of your profession, echoing off stone walls and wooden beams like some choir of pain and regret. Each shriek is unique, some high-pitched and panicked, others low and guttural, like a wounded animal. You used to offer comfort, a warm cloth, a whispered prayer, a lie about how this won't hurt much. That stopped after your 5th extraction, the one where the man bit through your glove and wept through the entire thing. Now there's no sugar-coating it. You don't have sugar anyway, just pliers, leather straps, and the kind of emotional distance that only a medieval dentist can develop. You don't have anesthesia. You don't even have numbing herbs most days. What you have is a bottle of wine to dull the edge, and if they're lucky, someone to hold them down, preferably a spouse or a strong neighbor who doesn't mind blood on their sleeves. The process is simple. You wedge open the mouth, you locate the offending tooth, you twist, pull, or bash, depending on how stubborn it is. The patient howls, flails, cries out to saints long dead, and you keep going, because if you stop, it only gets worse. Some scream before you even touch them. Others go stiff and silent, the kind of quiet that means they're too scared to breathe. You've had people faint. You've had people vomit. You've had people soil themselves mid-procedure, and you kept working through all of it. Sometimes they scream your name, not in gratitude, in curses. You've been called a demon, a butcher, a devil in boots. One man swore you were sent by hell to punish gluttons with iron pincers. You took it as a compliment. And afterward, most patients don't thank you. They stumble away, clutching their face, dripping blood and the muttering oaths. A few nod. Fewer pay. The ones who survive with their jaw intact are the closest thing you'll get to a 5-star review. But no one forgets you. Because in a world without comfort, you're the one who trades pain for slightly less pain. And people will always scream for that. It was bound to happen eventually. You've handled dozens, maybe hundreds, of screaming, flailing patients. You've dodged knees, elbows, and even one accidental headbutt from a panicked nun. But nothing prepares you for the bite. It starts like any other procedure. A local miller, sweating and snarling through a swollen cheek, comes in holding his jaw like it's going to fall off. "Just get it out," he growls. Classic tough guy. You position him, say your usual half prayer, and start inspecting the molar. A real mess. Black, cracked, barely holding on. You don't even need the pliers yet, you just poke around with your finger to check movement. That's when it happens. He clamps down, hard. Your finger is caught between 2 rotting teeth, and suddenly, you understand what real pain feels like. You scream, he screams, someone else in the waiting room screams out of sympathy. You try to pull away, but it's too late. His jaw locks with desperation. He's not attacking you. He's panicking. But your skin doesn't care about intentions. It's breaking. Blood fills your glove. Your mentor rushes in, tries to pry his mouth open with the blunt end of the tooth key. It works, eventually. You stagger back, holding your hand like it's made of fire. One of your fingertips is torn, the nail half gone. Your hand swells immediately. There's no antiseptic, of course. Just wine, boiled water, and the hope that God's not in a vengeful mood today. You wrap it tight and keep going. There are still 5 more extractions on the schedule, and you need the coins. By nightfall, your hand is red and throbbing. Infection sets in fast, because, surprise, human mouths are full of horrors. You develop a fever. For 2 days, you hallucinate conversations with the Virgin Mary about molars. Eventually, you recover. Mostly. Your finger never bends quite right again, A reminder. The miller, he sends you bread once a year, guilt-ridden and toothless. From then on, you work differently, faster, more cautious, and you start using a metal probe instead of your finger to test a loose tooth. Because in your line of work, the most dangerous bite isn't the dog's. You'd think the nobles, with their silk robes and feathered hats, would have better teeth. They don't. In fact, the wealthier they are, the worse their mouths tend to be. Why? Because they can afford luxuries the poor never taste. Sugar, candied fruits, imported wines, and pastries so sweet they practically melt the enamel off your teeth on contact. You're summoned to manor houses and castles where the floors are polished but the smiles are horrifying. Behind powdered faces and perfumed robes lurk mouths in full rebellion, abscesses the size of walnuts, gums like bruised fruit, and teeth so blackened you wonder if they've been cursed. And yet, the nobles expect grace, elegance, discretion. They sit on velvet cushions while you kneel beside them, peering into the jaws of what looks like a battlefield soaked in honey and rot. They want you to work quietly, quickly, and, if possible, without telling them exactly what you're removing. One noblewoman insists her tooth is only resting improperly. You remove it in 3 bleeding pieces. They don't scream like peasants. No, they groan theatrically. They faint with a flourish. They complain that the herbal rinse is too bitter or the linen too scratchy. One lord demanded you stop the extraction so he could compose himself with a poem. And then there's the cosmetic dentistry, because if a noble loses a front tooth, it must be covered or replaced. You've packed gaps with wax, painted teeth with white lead, which, yes, is toxic, and once carved a fake canine from ivory that promptly fell out during a banquet. They pay well, at least. Coins, chickens, rings, even a cloak once, though it smelled like wet dog. But they also expect favors, secrets kept, and egos stroked. You don't mind. Because every time a baron or duchess opens their mouth expecting perfection, and you peer inside to see the same festering trench as any beggar in the street, it reminds you of something important. Decay is democratic. It doesn't care how rich you are. And you're the great equalizer. Pliers in hand, ready to remind everyone that beneath the silk and titles, they all rot the same. By this point, your reputation precedes you, but not in the way you hoped. You walk into a tavern, and conversations die. Children duck behind their mothers. A man once spit at your feet and crossed himself, muttering something about plague demons. Another carved a charm to wear around his neck to ward off your curse. You're not a hero. You're not even a healer. You're the tooth man. And that means something dark. To the villagers, you're a necessary evil, like famine or taxes. They come to you only when the pain outweighs their terror. No one visits a medieval dentist casually. They wait until they're desperate, delirious, half hollowed out by infection. Then they appear at your door, trembling, hat in hand. You try to be gentle, at first, but gentleness doesn't matter. The moment they see the pliers, the fear takes over. Some flinch when you speak. Others don't meet your gaze. The bravest ones offer a nervous smile, with whatever teeth they still have. No one celebrates your work. When you do it well, they scream. When you do it poorly, they scream more. If you save a life, it's forgotten. If you botch a pull, it's legend. One woman claims you removed the wrong tooth. You didn't. But the story spreads anyway, until you're the man who steals molars for fun. A group of boys once followed you through town singing a little song. 1 for the farmer, 2 for the priest. Hide your teeth, or he'll make a feast. You laugh because you have to. But it stings. You never wanted to be feared. You wanted to help. Still, fear has its uses. People pay faster. They listen. No one questions your price when they think you might yank the wrong tooth just to prove a point. And when someone collapses in the street from an abscessed jaw, you're the first person they call. Not because they trust you, but because you're all they've got. So you roll up your sleeves, open your kit, and step into the ring once more. You're not loved. You're not liked. but you're remembered. When the plague comes, dentistry takes a back seat to pure survival. The Black Death doesn't care about cavities. It floods the streets with fevered bodies and leaves you wondering whether that abscessed jaw is just an abscess or the beginning of the end. Still, people come to you. They always do. Not because you're a miracle worker, but because you've handled pus before. You've seen swelling, drained rot, and packed wounds with herbs. You've watched people scream themselves hoarse from jaw infections. So what's one more plague boil between friends? Your work shifts from extractions to emergency lancing. Swollen necks, black gums, lymph nodes the size of chicken eggs. You heat your blade, grip the skin, and slice. Pus bursts like a blistered fruit. You don't gag anymore. You haven't in years. Sometimes they live, sometimes they don't. You start keeping track in chalk marks on your door, not out of vanity, but to keep your mind from unraveling. Payment is odd now. No one has coins, so they pay in bread, dried meat, or promises they won't live long enough to fulfill. A dying merchant gives you a ring. A widow gives you her late husband's boots. You sell what you can, bury what you must. The smells worsen. Your workshop becomes a hybrid clinic and crypt. You stack firewood for warmth, but it doesn't help. The chill is deeper now. In the bones. In the silence that comes when 3 patients in a row never sit up again. Still, you're busy. The plague is bad for the body, but good for business. And people whisper about you. The one who drained the poison from my neighbor's neck. The one who pulled 3 infected teeth and the man survived. The one who might know something the priests don't. You don't correct them. Because in a time when everyone is dying, being slightly less deadly makes you powerful. So you keep cutting, draining, packing wounds with mold and prayer. You don't sleep much. You don't speak unless needed. But you're alive and working. In the age of plague, you're no longer just the man with pliers. You're the one they call when it's almost too late. It begins with a dull ache. Nothing serious. A throb in your back molar after a long day, easily ignored. But you know better. You've seen this story 100 times in 100 mouths. It always starts as nothing. Then it becomes everything. At first, you pretend it's fatigue. You gargle wine. You chew on cloves. You rub your jaw when no one's looking. But inside you know, the rot has come for you. You try to work through it. After all, there are mouths worse than yours. Peasants with no teeth at all. Nobles whose breath wilts flowers. You've survived the screams of others. Surely you can survive your own. But the pain grows. It crawls up your jaw, into your ear, behind your eye. You stop eating. You stop speaking. You start dreaming about the tooth, the same one, over and over, falling out, growing worms, whispering to you in Latin. You consider asking your apprentice for help. But he's too green. He hesitates. He still wipes his tools on his sleeve. So one night, in the dim light of your own workshop, you do what you've done for years. You pull your own tooth. You wedge a wooden block between your molars, steady your hands, and reach in with the pliers. You've done this hundreds of times. You know exactly how to grip, twist, and remove. But you've never done it to yourself. The pain is indescribable, not because it's worse, but because it's yours. You groan, half in rage, half in agony. You sweat through your tunic. You taste blood, then more blood, and then finally, relief. Sort of. You drop the tooth into your tin bowl. It rattles next to the others. For a moment, you stare at it. It's just another ruined thing in a room full of them. You clean the wound. You don't pack it, not out of oversight but pride. You'll heal, or you won't. It's always been that way. The pain lessens, but something lingers, because for the first time, you understand what every scream really meant. And now, you carry it not just in your hands, but in your empty jaw. There's no grand ending for a medieval dentist, no cathedral burial, no gilded plaque, no choir singing praises of molars yanked and abscesses drained. Just an old man in a blood-stained apron, stooped over his bench, tools worn down to crooked metal nubs. Your hands ache now. Your knees grind like worn teeth. Your vision blurs in the evenings, and your ears ring with echoes of 1,000 past screams. The patients still come, but you move slower. You speak less. You grip the pliers with fingers that no longer close without pain. One day, you reach for bread and feel it. A crack. A soft crumble in your mouth. Another tooth gone. Your own. Again. You don't bother saving it. You've lost count. You no longer eat apples. You drink your meals now. Chew only when necessary. Your tongue searches the gaps in your mouth like a soldier walking a ruined battlefield. There are fewer survivors each year. You wonder sometimes if the villagers will remember you when you're gone. The man who wore death on his breath and mercy in his hands. The one who pulled more teeth than most people had in their heads. But truthfully, they won't build you a tomb. You're not a priest. You're not a knight. You're just the man who helped them scream a little less. Your grave will be shallow, your name scratched onto a wooden plank. Maybe, maybe not. But the work you did, it lives on. In every mouth that still chews without agony. In every child who didn't die from a jaw infection. In every noble who hid their rot behind a painted smile and never once said thank you. And in the bucket of teeth beneath your workbench. A quiet monument to a life of blood, rust, and nerve. When you die, there will be no mourning procession. Just a silence in the workshop and a smell that lingers for a day too long. Eventually, someone else will pick up the pliers. Someone younger, hungrier, less haunted. The screams will return. But for now, your hands go still. Your breath fades. And somewhere in the village, a child will feel a sharp pain in their tooth. They'll ask, "Where's the man who makes it stop?" But you'll be gone. No tombstone, just gums. Before silk, before linen, before anything remotely resembling a fashion statement, there was just skin. Human skin, exposed to sun, wind, cold, insects, and every other force nature could throw at us. In the earliest chapters of human history, clothing wasn't about style. It was about survival. The very first humans lived in harsh, unforgiving environments, and they had to get creative fast if they wanted to make it through the night. The solution? Whatever was lying around, animal hides from the hunt, flexible tree bark, woven reeds, and even grass twisted into primitive belts and skirts. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. And it was here, in this primal moment, that clothing was born. These weren't outfits, they were shields. The fur of a predator might keep you warm in winter, but it also made you smell like a meal to the next lion that came sniffing. Still, for early humans, warmth outweighed aesthetics. We wrapped ourselves in raw skins, tied them together with sinew or vines, and hoped for the best. But over time, even these crude covers started to take on symbolic meaning. The man wearing the biggest bear hide? Probably the one who killed it. The woman with the intricately woven grass skirt? Maybe she was the elder, the storyteller, the healer. Clothing began to signal more than just protection. It whispered status. The earliest archaeological evidence of clothing tools, bone needles, dates back nearly 40,000 years, suggesting we were already tailoring animal hides into more fitted garments. That's not just functional. That's thoughtful. That's human. And once we started migrating to different climates, icy tundras, sweltering deserts, humid jungles, our clothing evolved accordingly. In cold regions, layered furs and tight wrappings insulated our bodies. In hot climates, we shifted toward breathable, loosely draped fabrics. This wasn't just invention. It was adaptation. So while it's tempting to imagine early humans running wild and free, the reality is far more practical. From the moment we began covering ourselves, clothing became our first form of technology. A quiet revolution in fiber and fur, sewn together with necessity and just a hint of early pride. And this was only the beginning. When we think of ancient Egypt, We picture pyramids, golden masks, and jackal-headed gods. But look closer, and you'll notice something else. Everyone's dressed impeccably in linen. Not silk, not wool. Linen. And not just any linen. Smooth, bleached, and immaculately pleated. Egypt's hot, dry climate made linen the ideal fabric. It was light, breathable, and could be worn in layers without trapping too much heat. Made from the flax plant, linen took serious effort to produce. First, the flax was harvested, soaked, and beaten into submission. Then spun into fine threads, and finally woven into fabric. This wasn't casual wear. Linen was labor-intensive and therefore valuable. Pharaohs wore it, priests wore it, and even the dead wore it, mummified in layer after layer of carefully prepared linen wrappings. Egyptians believed clothing mattered not just in life, but in death. Your outfit helped secure your identity in the afterlife. A well-wrapped mummy wasn't just fashionable. It was spiritually fortified. Social status was literally woven into what you wore. The elite flaunted semi-transparent linen tunics, often pleated or dyed white, a color associated with purity and divine power. Ordinary workers wore simpler kilts, sometimes little more than a wrapped cloth tied with a belt. But they too appreciated linen's cool elegance. Children often wore nothing until puberty, but even their first cloth marked a rite of passage. Jewelry, of course, completed the ensemble. Wide collars of faience and gold, lapis lazuli amulets, beaded sandals. A nobleman's wardrobe might include wigs, kohl-lined eyes, and perfumed cones melting over the head at fancy banquets. Fashion in Egypt wasn't frivolous. It was ritual, identity, and rank. Priests, who had to remain ritually clean, only wore the finest white linen, and nothing of animal origin. No wool, no leather. Clothing was not just fabric. It was spiritual armor, separating sacred from profane. Even slaves and servants had clothing suited to their tasks, though rarely with adornment. Yet whether they worked the fields or tended the palace, linen defined Egyptian fashion for thousands of years. So while other civilizations were still bundling up in skins and wool, Egypt was pioneering one of humanity's first fabric revolutions. Smooth, sunlit, and stitched into eternity. If Egypt spun gold from flax, Mesopotamia wove its civilization in wool. In the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, the earliest city-states were also among the earliest trendsetters. Their fashion, draped robes, wide belts, and layers of wool, the pride of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. Wool was more than clothing here. It was economy. Sheep were everywhere, and their fleece was essential to Mesopotamian trade, temple offerings, and taxation. In fact, temple complexes managed flocks and textile production, like miniature empires. Clothing was centralized, sacred and bureaucratic, all at once. The typical outfit for men was the kaunikes, a wraparound skirt or tunic often made from tufted wool, giving it a shaggy, pelt-like appearance. At first glance, it looked like someone skinned a sheep and wore it untrimmed. That's not far from the truth. But over time, it became a stylized, ceremonial garment, even a royal one. Kings, priests, and deities were often depicted in kaunikes robes, indicating its prestige. Women's garments were similarly draped but sometimes extended to the ankles with one shoulder exposed. Practical, yet refined. These outfits weren't sewn or tailored like Egyptian linen. Instead, they were wrapped and pinned, shaped more by artistry than stitchwork. Social class dictated the details. Elites wore fine dyed wool, rich indigos, deep reds, sometimes decorated with fringe or embroidery. Servants and laborers wore coarser versions. And like in Egypt, children often went nude until a certain age. Modesty, after all, was a fluid concept in early civilizations. Mesopotamians also wore wide belts or girdles, often made of leather or wool cords, to hold their garments in place. These belts were status items, sometimes decorated with bronze studs or inscribed with names, prayers, or symbols of divine protection. Headwear was common, especially among men. Conical hats, headbands, and turbans marked identity and status. Soldiers and messengers might wear simple leather caps, while priests and royalty had more elaborate coverings. Jewelry completed the look: earrings, bracelets, and necklaces made of gold, silver, lapis, and carnelian. Even the poorest often wore at least a simple bead or amulet for protection. So while Egypt flowed with linen, Mesopotamia strutted in wool, raw, warm, and weighty with meaning. Their draped style wasn't just about fabric. It was about power, piety, and the world's first wardrobes. While Egypt mastered linen and Mesopotamia flaunted wool, the people of the Indus Valley quietly revolutionized clothing with something soft, breathable, and shockingly ahead of its time: cotton. Yes, actual spun and woven cotton. And they did it over 5,000 years ago. Centered around cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the Indus Valley civilization left behind no grand temples or royal tombs. But it did leave hints of a highly organized, hygienic, and fashion-conscious society. Their clothing was clean, minimal, and functional, perfectly suited to the hot, humid climate of what is now modern-day Pakistan and northwest India. The evidence we have comes from terracotta figurines, seal impressions, and some impressively detailed sculptures. Men typically wore a short kilt or wrapped cloth tied at the waist, while women draped longer garments, sometimes over one shoulder. Think of it like an early ancestor of the sari. Both sexes wore minimal but elegant clothing, always suited for movement and the heat. And yes, they were the first civilization known to cultivate cotton. This wasn't just resourceful, it was revolutionary. Cotton's breathability and softness made it ideal for daily life, especially in contrast to the heavier animal-based fibers of other regions. The Indus people spun it, wove it, and likely dyed it using natural pigments, perhaps indigo or turmeric, both of which were available in the region. Simplicity didn't mean dullness. Many figurines show women adorned with elaborate jewelry, bangles up the arms, earrings, and beaded necklaces. Hair was often styled or braided, and decorative combs and cosmetic containers have been found in excavations, hinting at daily grooming rituals. There's even a famous bronze sculpture known as the Dancing Girl, dating back to around 2500 BCE. She wears nothing but a handful of bangles, yet her pose, confidence, and adornment say everything about the cultural comfort, with both grace and minimalism. What's striking is how little waste and excess seem to have defined Indus fashion. There was no obsession with grandiosity, just well-made, locally sourced, climate-appropriate clothing that fits seamlessly into daily life. No gold-studded robes or thick layers, just the elegance of clean lines and clever fabric. In the quiet streets of Harappa, fashion wasn't loud, but it was years ahead of its time. By the time the Minoans rose to prominence around 2000 BCE on the island of Crete, fashion had taken a dramatic leap from modest functionality to something far more expressive, and frankly, fabulous. The Minoans didn't just wear clothes to survive the Mediterranean climate. They used clothing to dazzle, to move, to seduce, and perhaps most importantly, to dance. Minoan clothing was light and colorful, tailored not just for heat but for visual drama. Men typically wore loincloths or kilts, sometimes elaborate with patterned sashes, other times bare-chested with tight belts to emphasize the waist. But it was the women's fashion that truly stole the show. Depictions from Minoan frescoes, such as those at Knossos, show women wearing garments unlike anything seen in other ancient cultures. Fitted bodices with flounced, layered skirts, sometimes bell-shaped, often tiered, and remarkably, open fronts that left the breasts exposed. No, not by accident. This was fashion, possibly ritual, possibly status, and certainly intentional. These corset-like tops gave women an hourglass silhouette, cinching the waist while allowing freedom of movement. The skirts swung dramatically with every step, especially during the athletic dances and religious ceremonies Minoans were famous for. Clothing here wasn't static, it was kinetic. Every layer, fold, and color played with motion. The fabrics were likely linen or wool, dyed in bright blues, reds, yellows, and purples using plant-based pigments. Decorative borders, embroidery, and perhaps even imported threads added visual interest. Minoan tailors clearly understood flair. They weren't just cutting cloth, they were sculpting identity. Both men and women wore jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, and elaborate earrings, often made of gold, silver, and semi-precious stones like carnelian and turquoise. Hair was long and styled, sometimes curled or braided, with elaborate headdresses or hats for ceremonial occasions. Even children were dressed with care, indicating that clothing played a role not just in function, but in the performance of status, age, and role in society. And given the prominence of women in Minoan art, their elaborate clothing may have symbolized more than beauty. It may have conveyed authority. The Minoans brought fashion off the loom and onto the stage, making every hem a piece of theater and every outfit a living sculpture in motion. In ancient China, clothing was never just fabric. It was philosophy, hierarchy, and an instrument of imperial control. And at the heart of it all, silk. Glorious, shimmering silk. So prized, that people once believed it was spun from the gods. In truth, it came from the humble silkworm, but the impact of its discovery would ripple across continents and centuries. The origins of silk date back to the Neolithic period, with the earliest confirmed evidence from around 2700 BCE. According to legend, Empress Lezu was the first to unravel a cocoon that had fallen into her tea, discovering the delicate filament within. Whether true or not, silk production quickly became one of China's most guarded secrets. Revealing how to make it? Punishable by death. By the Shang and Zhou dynasties, silk had already become the hallmark of Chinese sophistication. Unlike rough wool or stiff linen, silk flowed, light, cool, and luminous. It was ideal for the varied climates of China, and it held dye beautifully. Imperial yellows, deep reds, and bold blues were woven into intricate patterns. Dragons for emperors, clouds for scholars, and waves for courtiers. Clothing became codified by class. The more silk you wore, the higher your rank. The cut, color, and even sleeve length could signal everything from your social station to your job. Commoners were forbidden from wearing certain colors or weaves, while members of the nobility floated through palaces in robes that practically whispered power with every step. The Han Dynasty, 216 BCE, 220 CE, elevated silk to a diplomatic weapon. Bolts of silk were traded with nomads, offered as tribute, and eventually sent westward along the Silk Road, giving the route its name. Chinese clothing, especially among elites, now featured wide-sleeved robes, sashes, and multiple layers. The way a robe folded, left over right, became a matter of cultural identity. Women's fashion included high-waisted skirts, long flowing sleeves, and decorative hairpins. Men's garments emphasized grace and humility, aligned with Confucian ideals. Clothing was expected to reflect inner virtue and cosmic balance. Silk wasn't just a luxury, it was a language, soft yet absolute. In ancient China, what you wore wasn't just how you looked, it was who you were, how you thought, and where you belonged. In ancient Greece, fashion didn't scream for attention. It flowed, wrapped, and whispered elegance. The Greeks weren't concerned with tailoring or stitching. Their approach to clothing was architectural, sculptural even. With a single length of cloth, they created garments that expressed movement, intellect, and grace. No scissors, no seams, just geometry, drapery, and a deep respect for form. The foundational Greek garment was the chiton, a rectangular piece of linen or wool, folded and pinned at the shoulders with brooches or fibulae, then belted at the waist. Depending on the material and drape, the chiton could be light and breezy or formal and layered. Men wore it knee-length, women ankle length. It was a canvas of identity, adaptable to age, gender, and occasion. Over this, citizens might wear a himation, a heavier cloak wrapped over one shoulder, useful for warmth, modesty, or drama, depending on how it was worn. Think of it as a wearable toga, a symbol of dignity and contemplation, often associated with philosophers, statesmen, and elders. The Greeks believed that clothing should mirror inner virtue. Simplicity was celebrated. Extravagance was frowned upon, especially in Athens, where public modesty was a civic virtue. Spartan men were even stricter, often going barefoot, cloaked in coarse red wool, emphasizing austerity over appearance. But don't let the simplicity fool you. Greek garments could be stunning. Wealthier citizens wore dyed and embroidered chitons in saffron, indigo, or crimson, adorned with meander patterns and mythological motifs. Jewelry, hairstyling, and cosmetics enhanced the overall look. Women decorated their hair with ribbons, tiaras, or intricate braids. Men groomed their beards with as much pride as their rhetoric. Footwear was optional. Sandals were common, but many Greeks preferred to go barefoot, especially in temples or at symposia. Clothing wasn't just for covering. It was a conversation with society. A well-draped himation could express nobility. A disheveled chiton might signal mourning or madness. Greek statues, often modeled after living people, preserved the folds of these garments in marble. Even gods wore chitons and cloaks, reminding mortals that beauty lay in form, not flash. In the end, Greek fashion wasn't about what you wore, but how you wore it. With thought, with poise, and above all, with philosophy woven into every fold. If the Greeks draped their identity in flowing elegance, the Romans tailored theirs into order. Roman clothing wasn't just about comfort or beauty. It was law, rank, and Romanita stitched together. What you wore in Rome told the world exactly who you were, how much power you had, and even where you could sit in the Senate. The most iconic Roman garment was the toga, a massive semicircular woolen cloth, up to 20 feet long, wrapped meticulously around the body. It was bulky, impractical, and required practice to wear properly. But that was the point. Only male Roman citizens could wear the toga. It was a symbol of Roman citizenship, and by extension, Roman superiority. Togas came in different styles and colors depending on your status. The toga virilis was plain white, worn by adult male citizens. The toga praetexta, with a purple border, was for magistrates and certain priests. And the toga picta, dyed entirely purple with gold embroidery, was reserved for emperors and triumphant generals. Purple dye, derived from the Murex sea snail, was so expensive it was essentially worth its weight in gold. But most Romans didn't wear togas every day. The tunic, a simple belted garment made of wool or linen, was the daily go-to. Short for men, long for women. Slaves and laborers wore basic, unadorned tunics, while senators had theirs marked with broad purple stripes, latus clavus. Even the width of a stripe could separate a senator from a knight. Women wore stolas, long sleeveless dresses often layered over a tunic, tied at the shoulders and belted at the waist. Married women covered their heads with a palla, a rectangular shawl that added modesty and mobility. For upper-class women, appearance was power. Fabrics grew more colorful, jewelry more elaborate, and hairstyles more towering with each passing dynasty. Romans also loved footwear. Sandals, boots, and indoor slippers reflected one's place in society. A soldier's caligae was not the same as a senator's red shoes. Even the enslaved had designated attire, usually a rough tunic, but they could be dressed well if their master wanted to show off. In Rome, nothing was accidental. Even your clothing was a proclamation of citizenship, class, gender, morality, and ambition, all wrapped into wool, fastened with a brooch, and displayed to the world like a walking scroll of status. As the Roman Empire crumbled and its togas unraveled, a new wave of fashion emerged from the so-called barbarians, a term the Romans used for anyone beyond their borders. But these outsiders, Goths, Franks, Celts, Saxons, and Vandals, weren't uncivilized brutes in rags. Their clothing was not only practical, but in many ways a preview of the medieval wardrobe to come. The northern European climate was harsh, far too cold and muddy for open tunics and flowing togas. So, barbarian fashion favored warmth, movement, and utility. Wool was the dominant material, thick and insulating. Cloaks, trousers, long-sleeved tunics, and fur-lined boots were standard, tailored for riding horses, trekking through forests, and waging war. One of the greatest innovations they brought to the fashion world? Pants. That's right. The trousers we now consider everyday essentials were a foreign concept to the toga-wrapped Romans. Initially viewed with disdain, pants became indispensable as Roman soldiers adopted them while fighting in colder regions. Eventually, they spread into common use throughout Europe. Men wore bracca, a form of early trousers, with a tunic and often a belt or leather harness across the chest. Women wore layered wool dresses with long sleeves, often cinched at the waist, and draped cloaks fastened with ornate brooches or pins. Colorful dyes were popular. Reds, blues, and greens derived from plants and minerals, and patterns like checks or stripes began to appear, foreshadowing Celtic tartans. Clothing also communicated allegiance and tribe. Brooches, belt buckles, and fibulae were not just functional. They bore symbols of lineage, mythology, or rank. The Celts, for example, created intricate metalwork that blended art with attire. Hair and grooming varied. Long hair and beards for warriors, braided styles for women, and even facial tattoos in some Celtic tribes. Jewelry made of bronze, amber, and glass was common, worn by both genders. By the time the Western Roman Empire fell, the so-called barbarian dress had laid the foundation for medieval European clothing, layered, woolen, and built for real life. Less about ceremony, more about survival, but still rich with meaning, beauty, and cultural pride. And so, from the linen kilts of pharaohs to the woolen cloaks of kings-to-be, ancient clothing stitched together far more than bodies. It wove together entire civilizations. Queen Tati was born into a world on fire, not with flames, but with ambition, betrayal, and the slow grind of empires locking horns over the fragile spine of the Levant. The Amurru kingdom, her homeland, was not a mighty empire like Egypt or the Hittites. It was small, fragmented, and perpetually caught in the middle of bigger powers that viewed it less as a sovereign nation and more as a useful buffer zone. Situated in what is now western Syria and northern Lebanon, Amurru was a land of hills, trade routes, and competing loyalties. By the time Tati was born, likely in the 14th century BCE, the kingdom was already a diplomatic hot potato, tossed between Egyptian pharaohs, Mitanni warlords, and the ever-expanding Hittite kings. It was not an easy place to rule, but it was a vital one. Tati's early life would have been shaped by court intrigue, foreign emissaries, and the constant anxiety of invasion or rebellion. Whether she was born into the royal house or married into it, she would have been trained in the arts of diplomacy, survival, and ceremonial leadership from a young age. In Amurru, a queen wasn't just ornamental. She was a negotiator, a symbol of stability, and sometimes the glue holding a divided court together. The region was in flux. The once powerful Mitanni kingdom was crumbling, losing territory and influence to the rising Hittites. Egypt, under Amenhotep III and later Akhenaten, still considered Amurru part of its sphere of influence. Meanwhile, local rulers constantly weighed their options. Should they swear loyalty to Egypt, gamble with the Hittites, or try to play both sides? Tati came of age in this storm. As a woman in a male-dominated political landscape, her rise to visible power is remarkable in itself. The fact that she was mentioned in Hittite diplomatic records, official correspondence between kings, suggests not just status, but authority. She wasn't a background figure. She was at the table. Though the historical record is sparse, her name alone reveals something crucial. In a time when most women were erased from stone and clay, Queen Tati made herself known. And that was only the beginning. In the world of the late Bronze Age, diplomacy was often brutal, and alliances rarely lasted longer than a harvest season. Yet Queen Tati appears in the historical record not as a footnote, but as a named political actor, something almost unheard of for a woman in this era. She is referenced in Hittite diplomatic archives, specifically in the correspondence surrounding the fate of Amuru. That she is mentioned at all tells us volumes. The context of her appearance in these records is significant. Around the time Tati rose to power, Amuru's ruling elite had to decide: stay loyal to the faltering Egyptian grip or align with the rising Hittite Empire. This was no small choice. Egypt had long claimed Amuru as a vassal territory. The Hittites, however, were expanding aggressively and beginning to peel off Egypt's northern allies, one by one. It's within this dangerous political game that Tati's name emerges. The Hittites were negotiating terms with the leadership of Amuru, and Tati was involved. Some interpretations of the Hittite texts suggest that she may have acted as a regent or co-ruler, perhaps during a time of succession crisis, or possibly even as the widow of a former king. In any case, her role wasn't ceremonial. She had enough clout that the most powerful empire in the Near East at the time, the Hittites, had to acknowledge her. Tati's political weight also points to something more profound: the flexible and pragmatic nature of power in Amuru. Unlike Egypt or Assyria, where royal women were largely excluded from governance, smaller kingdoms sometimes allowed, or required, queens to step in when dynastic lines faltered or political survival demanded broader alliances. We don't know what Tati looked like. We don't have statues, busts, or paintings. But in the dusty lines of clay cuneiform, we find something better: evidence of her influence. She stood in an arena of kings, ambassadors, generals, and warlords, and held her own. In an age when marriages brokered treaties and betrayal was always one banquet away, Tati's presence in diplomatic documents shows she wasn't a pawn. She was a player. To understand Queen Tati's world is to enter a whirlwind of power politics. Her kingdom, Amuru, sat like a fragile stone between three grinding tectonic plates: the Hittite Empire rising from Anatolia, Egypt reigning from the south, and the crumbling Mitanni Kingdom to the east. Tati's rule unfolded in the shadow of their rivalries, each one casting a different kind of threat or opportunity. Egypt, under the late 18th dynasty, had long considered Amuru part of its imperial network. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Amenhotep III had installed local vassals, demanded tribute, and expected obedience. Yet the Egyptian grip on the northern Levant had begun to loosen, especially during the religious turmoil of Akhenaten's reign. Egypt was distracted, vulnerable, and preoccupied with gods instead of generals. Meanwhile, the Mitanni, once a major power in the region, were rapidly deteriorating. Internal strife and military defeats had opened them to invasion from the east and north. Their former allies were watching closely. Amuru, a former Mitanni vassal, found itself increasingly isolated. Then came the Hittites, under the brilliant and ruthless leadership of Suppiluliuma the Maya. This king wasn't content with ruling Anatolia. He had his sights set on the Syrian corridor, including Amuru. Suppiluliuma launched military campaigns deep into the Levant, breaking down Mitanni resistance and seizing one city-state after another. His goal was simple: control the trade routes, neutralize Egypt's influence, and bring strategic regions like Amuru into his orbit. This was the world Tati navigated, a triangle of power, each point burning with ambition. She could not afford missteps. Choosing Egypt risked Hittite retribution. Backing the Hittites might anger local factions still loyal to the pharaoh. And aligning with the decaying Mitanni was a gamble at best. Yet amid this storm, Queen Tati didn't vanish. She remained politically visible, mentioned in Hittite negotiations, likely weighing loyalties with every caravan that passed through her kingdom's passes. She wasn't just surviving, she was maneuvering. Her rule, or regency, occurred during one of the most volatile eras of the late Bronze Age. And instead of being crushed by the chaos, Tati seems to have used it. Not to dominate, but to endure. At some point during Queen Tati's life, a political earthquake shook the foundations of Amuru's foreign policy. The kingdom officially defected from Egypt's influence and aligned with the Hittite Empire. This decision wasn't made lightly. It redefined Amuru's place on the map, triggered Egyptian retaliation, and cemented the kingdom's role in one of the most complex diplomatic networks of the Bronze Age. The Hittite king Suppiluliuma Thame, a master strategist and expansionist, had already begun pulling small Levantine kingdoms into his sphere through both military might and shrewd negotiation. When Amuru's leadership, likely with Queen Tati at the center, agreed to switch sides, the deal wasn't sealed with just words. It was formalized in a treaty. In the Hittite cuneiform archives, this treaty survives, though it centers on the male ruler of Amuru, most likely Tati's husband or relative. It's important to recognize that Tati's name appears in related diplomatic correspondence, showing she was not a silent partner. She may have played a vital role in the negotiation, especially in managing the domestic blowback and foreign expectations. The treaty spelled out key obligations. Amuru would now be a vassal of the Hittite king. In return, the Hittites promised protection, not just from Egypt, but from rival tribes and internal dissent. This was more than a handshake. It was a survival pact. Egypt did not take this betrayal lightly. Pharaoh Akhenaten viewed the shift as treason. The Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablet correspondence between Egyptian officials and their vassals, hint at diplomatic outrage and urgent demands. Tati's court must have braced for retaliation. But aligning with the Hittites was, strategically, the smarter bet. Suppiluliuma's military campaigns had shattered Mitanni power, and Egypt was slipping into religious and political instability. Tati's decision, and yes, we must call it hers too, was one of calculated realism. The treaty with the Hittites was a turning point. It gave Amuru security, but at a cost. The kingdom was no longer a neutral buffer. It had picked a side in a war of empires. And once you chose a side, there was no going back. Queen Tati didn't just witness this shift, she helped steer it. The moment Amuru allied with the Hittites, Queen Tati and her court became the eye of a geopolitical storm. Egypt was furious. Once considered a loyal vassal state, Amuru had now, in Egyptian eyes, committed outright betrayal. And betrayal in the Bronze Age didn't just provoke letters, it provoked retaliation. The Amarna letters, the cache of diplomatic correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and their vassals, reflect this tension. Egypt accused Amuru's leadership of treachery, questioned their honor, and demanded obedience. While Tati's name isn't front and center in these texts, the fact that she appears in Hittite records during the same period suggests she was deeply involved in the storm behind the scenes. What followed was not just a clash of armies, but a battle of loyalties. Egypt began pressing neighboring rulers to isolate Amuru. Border skirmishes likely increased. Tati would have been faced with managing not just external threats, but internal dissent. Not everyone in Amuru agreed with the pivot to the Hittites, especially those who had benefited from years of Egyptian patronage. Merchants, military leaders, and even members of the royal household may have questioned the wisdom of this alliance. Tati had to tread carefully. Her position was likely strengthened by her proximity to the throne, possibly as queen mother, regent, or senior consort. Her experience and diplomatic skill would have been critical in holding the kingdom together. She wasn't just navigating battlefield strategy, she was managing the emotional landscape of betrayal, the breakdown of generations-old alliances, and the psychological toll of war. But betrayal can also be a path to reinvention. By siding with the Hittites, Amuru gained a new identity, not as a minor client of Egypt, but as a key Hittite ally in the Levant. This repositioning came with economic benefits too. Trade routes shifted, Hittite merchants and envoys arrived. Roads were secured under new terms. For Queen Tati, the aftermath of betrayal was survival under pressure. Her legacy, preserved only in fragments, is one of tightrope diplomacy. She didn't have the luxury of certainty. Every decision could spark invasion or civil unrest. Yet, amid the chaos, she endured. And in the Bronze Age, enduring was often the greatest form of victory. In an age where most queens were unnamed, unseen, and largely forgotten by official records, Queen Tati of Amurru left behind something extraordinary. A name carved into clay. Her appearance in Hittite diplomatic archives is more than just a footnote. It's a rare glimpse into the agency and influence of a Bronze Age woman on the world stage. Tati is mentioned in the context of treaties and letters between Amurru and the Hittite Empire, particularly under the reign of Suppiluliuma I, the master tactician of Anatolia. These records, preserved on cuneiform tablets found in the Royal Archive of Hattusa, show that Tati was more than a ceremonial figure. She was either directly involved in diplomatic dealings or wielded enough power that her presence had to be acknowledged. One specific letter describes the political situation in Amurru following its defection from Egypt. In it, Tati is named alongside other political actors, suggesting she had a voice in how the kingdom positioned itself, responded to crises, and managed its alliances. Was she a queen regent during a king's minority, a widow defending her late husband's legacy, or perhaps even the sole authority in a time of male absence? We can't be certain. But what's clear is that her name wasn't ornamental. It was operational. For the Hittites to mention a queen by name in their diplomatic language was not routine. It signals her recognized influence, perhaps even respect. Hittite diplomacy was cold and pragmatic. Titles weren't handed out for flattery. If Tati was mentioned, it was because she was part of the machinery of power. This is especially significant considering that most Bronze Age international correspondence was between kings. Queens were usually silent allies, referenced indirectly, if at all. But Tati's presence is carved into the same documents that tracked alliances, warfare, tribute, and betrayal. Through these clay tablets, she speaks, not in her own words, but through the acknowledgement of others. That alone marks her as exceptional. She lived at a time when the world was loud with war and shifting alliances, and still, her voice made it into the record. In the bureaucratic silence of ancient empires, Queen Tati's name echoes with quiet strength. By aligning Amurru with the Hittite Empire, Queen Tati ensured her kingdom's survival, but at a cost. The alliance brought not just protection, but also oversight. And at the heart of that oversight was Suppiluliuma I, the towering Hittite king who reshaped the Near East with iron will and strategic brilliance. For Tati, navigating her kingdom's new place under his watchful eye meant walking a razor-thin line between partnership and subjugation. Suppiluliuma wasn't a passive overlord. His control of client states like Amurru was absolute in all but name. He dispatched envoys, demanded tribute, and expected compliance. Tati and her court were expected to follow the terms of their treaty to the letter, offering military support, securing trade routes, and allowing Hittite influence to permeate their administration. It's likely that Tati had to host Hittite advisors at court, perhaps even see Hittite troops stationed nearby. Her decisions, foreign and domestic, were no longer entirely her own. But she wasn't powerless. Tati's skill was not in defying Suppiluliuma, but in managing his expectations, gaining his trust, and leveraging the alliance to solidify her internal rule. Her real challenge may have come not from the Hittites, but from within. Local elites, merchants, and religious figures accustomed to Egyptian patronage may have chafed under new Hittite customs and oversight. Tati had to be the buffer, appeasing her powerful overlord while quelling discontent at home. That required diplomacy of the highest order, not to mention a keen understanding of personalities, politics, and shifting loyalties. And still, the Hittite king trusted her court enough to enforce loyalty. That speaks volumes. In an era where failed vassals were swiftly replaced or destroyed, Tati's Amurru remained intact. Her leadership was steady. Her presence in the diplomatic record continued. This wasn't the freedom of a sovereign queen. It was something far more precarious. The role of a broker between empire and people, survival and autonomy. And few played that role better. Tati lived in Sepululiuma's shadow, but she wasn't eclipsed by it. She understood how to bend without breaking. And in the brutal calculus of Bronze Age politics, that was a triumph in itself. Queen Tati's survival in the historical record is rare, almost miraculous. The Bronze Age wasn't known for preserving the names of women, let alone their accomplishments. Yet Tati's name endures, inscribed in Hittite diplomatic texts, not as a wife, not as a shadow behind a king, but as a participant in statecraft. Her legacy, though faint, shines in contrast to the silence surrounding so many other women of her time. The late Bronze Age was filled with royal women whose influence was quietly immense. Queens of Egypt like Ta and Nefertiti, or Hittite royal women like Pudu-Hepa, who would rise decades later to become a formidable co-ruler. But most of these women were either from powerful dynasties or married to dominant kings. Tati, by contrast, came from, or operated within, a regional buffer state, constantly caught between conquest and collapse. That makes her presence in foreign archives even more remarkable. We don't have monuments or statues of Tati, no gold death mask, no temple with her face carved in stone. Her kingdom was not one of monumental architecture, but of diplomatic survival, held together with treaties, strategic marriages, and compromise. Her legacy is written not in marble, but in baked clay tablets, fragile, easily lost, yet somehow still whispering her name through time. She stands as a rare example of a Bronze Age woman who held power during a time of immense geopolitical change. Tati may have been a queen regent, a ruling consort, or the widow of a king. But whatever her title, she wielded actual influence. She navigated wars between superpowers, betrayal from former allies, and the shifting sands of Near Eastern politics, without losing her grip on power. And even more importantly, her story challenges the notion that ancient women were always passive figures behind male rulers. Tati was neither passive nor forgotten. She was named, recorded, and remembered, however briefly, by scribes who usually wrote only of kings. Her story reminds us that history is often unfair in its memory, but not always blind. Some voices, even faint ones written in clay, can still echo through the ages. Queen Tati's final years are cloaked in silence. The records that mention her fall away, and the clay tablets that once preserved her name give way to more ominous signs. The signs of a world beginning to unravel. The late Bronze Age was drawing to a close, and with it, the intricate network of diplomacy, trade, and royal alliances that had held the region together for centuries. We do not know how or when Tati died. There is no mention of her burial, no inscription boasting of her accomplishments. But we know that Amuru, like many other city-states and kingdoms of the time, was about to be swept into the chaos of what modern historians call the Bronze Age collapse. A mysterious, decades-long period of destruction, depopulation, and cultural fragmentation. Between 1200 and 1150 BCE, the great powers of the ancient world fell like dominoes. The Hittite Empire crumbled. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece were abandoned. Cities burned from Anatolia to Canaan. The cause? Scholars still debate it. War, famine, drought, earthquakes, internal revolt, or the sudden appearance of the mysterious sea peoples. Most likely, it was all of them at once. A perfect storm of disaster. Amuru, caught between the dying Hittites and the resurgent Egypt under Ramses III, would not escape unscathed. Its strategic location, once a blessing, now became a curse. Armies passed through. Supply lines dried up. Alliances disintegrated. The political chessboard where Tati had once moved carefully was upended. The board flipped, the pieces scattered. And yet, the fact that we know her name at all is extraordinary. Tati may have vanished from history's center stage, but she lived, and likely ruled, through one of the most dangerous and pivotal periods in ancient history. Her decisions, her alliances, and her survival strategy left ripples that were felt long after she disappeared from the record. In the end, Queen Tati was not part of a glorious conquest or a sweeping dynasty. She was something rarer, a political survivor in a collapsing world. And though her legacy lies buried beneath ruins and faded into crumbling clay, her name remains, defiant, dignified, and unforgettable. A queen without a tombstone, but not without memory. Long before the drills and dynamite arrived, the mountain now known as Mount Rushmore stood in quiet majesty, untouched by chisels or presidents. To most Americans in the early 20th century, it was just another granite peak in the rugged Black Hills of South Dakota. But to the Lakota Sioux, it was sacred. They called it Paha Sapa, the heart of everything that is, a spiritual center, not a stage. The Black Hills had been granted to the Lakota in the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, a legal promise that the land would remain theirs forever. But forever proved brief. After gold was discovered in the region just years later, prospectors flooded in, and the US government reneged on the treaty. The hills were seized, and the Lakota were pushed aside. Their sacred spaces sold, mined, and eventually dynamited. By the 1920s, the United States was craving myth. The trauma of World War I had passed, but a new kind of identity crisis had emerged, one defined by modernity, rapid industrial change, and the search for a unifying national story. Against that backdrop, a South Dakota historian named Doane Robinson came up with a bold idea: carve giant figures of American heroes into a mountainside to attract tourism and celebrate the country's greatness. Robinson originally envisioned Western figures, Lewis and Clark, Red Cloud, Buffalo Bill. But once Gutzon Borglum, a fiercely ambitious sculptor with a love for grandeur and nationalism, joined the project, the scope shifted. Borglum proposed something far more dramatic: the faces of 4 US presidents, carved at monumental scale into the granite cliffs. The mountain chosen for the project was not selected by accident. It offered solid granite, high visibility, and favorable sun exposure. But it also stood on land taken from indigenous people, a fact ignored or dismissed by the project's boosters. At the time, the mountain didn't even carry its now famous name in Lakota tradition. Mount Rushmore was a colonial label, coined after a visiting New York lawyer in 1885. The land, once full of tribal stories and ancient rhythms, was about to become something else entirely: a monument to empire, ambition, and the American mythos. The face of the mountain was blank, but not empty. The man who would give Mount Rushmore its colossal faces was no ordinary artist. Gutzon Borglum was as much a showman as a sculptor, a man obsessed with legacy, nationalism, and monumentality. When he arrived in South Dakota in the mid-1920s, he wasn't looking to carve a mountain. He was looking to carve his name into history. Born in 1867 to Danish immigrants in Idaho, Borglum studied art in Paris and was heavily influenced by classical sculpture and the romantic nationalism of 19th-century Europe. He admired size, symbolism, and the idea that art should inspire civic pride. His work had already appeared in public spaces across the US, and he had earned a reputation for bold, large-scale projects. But it was his brief, controversial involvement with the Confederate Memorial at Stone Mountain in Georgia that defined much of his early fame and notoriety. That project fell apart amid funding issues and creative disagreements. Borglum left the South in a storm of accusations and broken contracts, but he took with him something valuable: experience with granite, explosives, and the sheer mechanics of mountain carving. When South Dakota's Doane Robinson came calling with his idea to boost tourism through monumental sculpture, Borglum saw an opportunity to start over, bigger, and this time under his full artistic control. But Borglum didn't want to carve regional heroes. He saw something grander, a shrine to American democracy, featuring presidents who, in his view, shaped the nation's destiny. He chose George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt, each representing a different pillar of the Republic. founding, expansion, preservation, and development. Borglum's involvement transformed Mount Rushmore from a state-level tourism gimmick into a federal monument project. He had powerful connections. Even President Calvin Coolidge gave his blessing. And he knew how to secure funding, attract media attention, and pitch patriotic symbolism. For Borglum, art was a tool of myth-making. But his vision was also wrapped in controversy. He held strong nationalist beliefs, and his past flirtations with white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan during the Stone Mountain Project have cast a long shadow over his legacy. Still, his skill was undeniable, and when he looked at the Black Hills, he didn't see rock. He saw immortality waiting to be carved. Mount Rushmore was never sculpted with hammers and chisels alone. It was blasted, drilled, and jackhammered into existence with precision and violence. A controlled chaos orchestrated by Gutzon Borglum and a crew of over 400 men. From 1927 to 1941, the mountain rang daily with explosions as granite gave way to vision. Work began with George Washington's face, chosen both for symbolism and practical reasons. Washington's likeness, at over 60 feet tall, would become the template for the rest. But carving a mountain isn't like shaping marble. Granite is hard, unforgiving, and prone to fractures. To make it work, Borglum and his team relied on an unusual blend of artistry and engineering. The process began with dynamite. Blasting crews used carefully calculated charges to remove massive amounts of rock, shaving away the mountain's bulk in layers. After the blasts, drillers and pointmen would climb scaffolding hundreds of feet above the ground to refine the shapes with jackhammers and hand tools. Men dangled from ropes, carving eyebrows and noses from sheer cliffs. It was skilled labor, dangerous and often deafening, but also oddly intimate. Each face took years to complete, and mistakes could not be undone. Despite the scale, the tools were shockingly ordinary. Workers used basic equipment, powered by compressors and ingenuity. Safety was a concern, but remarkably, no one was killed during the 14 years of construction. A fact Borglum proudly touted. Many of the workers were miners, stonecutters, or unemployed laborers from the Great Depression. For them, it was a job, a paycheck, and a piece of history. Progress was slow, and funding was inconsistent. The Great Depression hit just as the project got underway, leading to delays and the constant need for federal support. Borglum, ever the political operator, secured New Deal funding and used patriotic rhetoric to keep momentum alive. As each president's face emerged, first Washington, then Jefferson, Lincoln, and finally Roosevelt, the mountain transformed into a national myth. It wasn't just about likeness, it was about idealism. These were not men, they were symbols, carved from the same rock as the country's founding myths. But behind every blast and chisel stroke was a contradiction. A monument to freedom, carved into stolen land by men working through economic despair. To millions of visitors, Mount Rushmore is a patriotic symbol, a shrine to democracy carved in stone. But to the Lakota Sioux, it is a wound. The monument was carved into the Black Hills, or Pahasapa, a place held sacred by the Lakota long before the first dynamite charge ever echoed through the cliffs. For them, this wasn't just granite. It was holy. The 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie had guaranteed the Black Hills to the Lakota people in perpetuity. But when gold was discovered in the region just a few years later, the US government tore up that agreement. Soldiers came, settlers followed. The land was seized, and with it, the heart of Lakota cultural and spiritual life. By the time Gutzon Borglum arrived with blueprints and scaffolding, the Lakota had already lost more than territory. They had lost trust in every treaty ever signed. And then, as if to twist the knife, the faces of 4 American presidents were chosen to be carved into the hills, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, 2 men associated with indigenous displacement and the expansion of settler colonialism. From the Lakota perspective, Mount Rushmore isn't a tribute, it's a desecration. It represents broken promises, land theft, and the ongoing erasure of native sovereignty. And it stands in contrast to the nearby peak of Thunderhead Mountain, where another colossal carving, the Crazy Horse Memorial, was later commissioned by Lakota leaders as a counter-monument, still unfinished but growing year by year. The Lakota weren't consulted when Mount Rushmore was proposed. Their protests were ignored. Their cultural claims to the land were overridden by federal courts and public opinion. Even today, they continue to assert their rights through activism, legal challenges, and symbolic acts, like the 1980 Supreme Court ruling in United States versus Sioux Nation, which acknowledged that the Black Hills were taken illegally. The Lakota were awarded compensation, but they've refused the money. They want the land back. So, while Mount Rushmore may seem silent and immovable, it is layered with unresolved conflict. It is not just a monument, it is a mirror. And depending on where you stand, what you see reflected can look like pride or pain. The face of George Washington was the first to emerge from the granite, a 60-foot portrait of the man often called the father of the nation. Gutzon Borglum chose Washington to symbolize the birth of the United States, its revolution, its ideals, and its earliest identity as a new republic. But as the granite was blasted away, the face that appeared was more than a likeness. It was mythology made stone. Washington's carving began in 1930 and set the tone for the rest of the monument. His face required years of work, from explosives to fine chiseling, and was unveiled in stages. Borglum insisted that the facial expression project calm authority, a vision of timeless leadership. The symmetry had to be flawless. The nose alone was over 20 feet long. Next came Thomas Jefferson, originally intended to be carved to Washington's right. But the granite proved too unstable, and the partially carved face had to be blasted away. Jefferson was relocated to Washington's left, and construction restarted from scratch. It was a setback that cost time, money, and morale. But eventually, Jefferson's visage appeared, staring with distant determination over the Black Hills. Jefferson was chosen to represent the expansion of the United States, particularly through the Louisiana Purchase. But his inclusion carries weight beyond politics. Jefferson was a complex figure, a writer of liberty, yet an owner of slaves, a visionary Democrat, yet a man who viewed indigenous lands as territory to be absorbed by the growing American state. Carving these two founders into Lakota sacred land was not just symbolic, it was inflammatory. Washington had overseen military campaigns against native tribes. Jefferson had authored policies that encouraged westward settlement, laying the groundwork for decades of displacement. Yet to many Americans, these men stood for reason, freedom, and the Enlightenment values that shaped the Republic. Borglum saw in them a pantheon of American gods. He wanted their faces to outlast centuries, to gaze upon the nation's future with ageless authority. And with Washington and Jefferson complete, Mount Rushmore had begun to take its shape, a sculpture not only of four men, but of the story America tells about itself. Whether you see founders or conquerors depends on which side of history you're standing. With Washington and Jefferson complete, Mount Rushmore was already becoming a national icon. But Gutzon Borglum wasn't finished. To complete his vision of America's evolution, he turned next to Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, two presidents chosen not for their proximity to the founding, but for how they steered the country through crisis and transformation. Abraham Lincoln, the third face carved, was Borglum's personal favorite. He admired Lincoln as a unifier, the man who preserved the Union during the Civil War and ended the institution of slavery. To Borglum, Lincoln symbolized the preservation of the nation. His face, somber and sunken-eyed, presented the weight of leadership during the country's darkest hour. Carving Lincoln's face into the granite took years, from 1937 to 1939, and required immense attention to detail. His deeply set eyes, high cheekbones, and signature beard were etched slowly, often by hand with pneumatic hammers. Then came Theodore Roosevelt, a more unconventional choice at the time. Borglum selected him to represent the development of modern America, its industrial might, economic ambition, and growing global presence. Roosevelt had been a personal friend of Borglum's, and his progressive reforms, trust-busting campaigns, and environmental conservation efforts made him, in Borglum's eyes, the ideal figure of dynamic leadership. Roosevelt's face, carved snugly between Lincoln and Jefferson, was a technical challenge due to its recessed position and thick-rimmed spectacles. A detail carefully shaped into the stone using metal rods to suggest the lenses. His inclusion was controversial. Critics argued that Roosevelt hadn't yet earned a place alongside the other giants of American history. But Borglum insisted and prevailed. Together, Lincoln and Roosevelt completed the four-part narrative: birth, expansion, preservation, development. It was a chronological march through American ambition, as seen through the eyes of its most powerful leaders. But each of these men, particularly Lincoln and Roosevelt, had complicated legacies involving indigenous policy, imperialism, and internal strife. Still, their faces, now larger than life, were intended to be permanent. They were carved to endure thousands of years. And as their stone expressions took shape, Mount Rushmore stopped being just a work of art. It became a symbol, not of who these men were, but of what the country wanted them to be. Building Mount Rushmore wasn't just an artistic feat, it was a political hustle. From its inception, the project was entangled in the currents of American nationalism, economic desperation, and bureaucratic red tape. Carving four colossal faces into a mountain required more than vision. It required money, a lot of it, and Gutzon Borglum was relentless in chasing every dollar. When work began in 1927, the economy was still booming. But just 2 years later, the Great Depression hit, and funding dried up across the country. Infrastructure projects collapsed, banks failed, and bread lines formed. Yet Mount Rushmore kept going. Why? Because Borglum understood the power of spectacle and the politics of pride. He pitched the monument as more than a tribute to presidents. He sold it as a shrine to democracy, a symbol of hope in a time of despair. He lobbied Congress, courted presidents, and spoke to anyone who would listen. Borglum wasn't just an artist, he was a propagandist, and Mount Rushmore was his stage. In the 1930s, the federal government, under Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, began pouring money into public works. Borglum secured federal funds through the National Park Service, which transformed the monument from a regional curiosity into a national project. The idea of carving American greatness into a mountain suddenly became an economic lifeline, creating jobs, boosting tourism, and stirring patriotic feeling. But the fundraising process wasn't smooth. Borglum clashed constantly with oversight boards, resisted creative compromises, and demanded full artistic control. He often exaggerated progress to secure more money, and even tried to expand the project beyond the four faces, proposing full torsos, an entablature, and a grand hall of records behind the heads. These were never completed. Public support was mixed. Many were proud, seeing the project as proof that America could endure and build, even in hard times. But critics saw it as wasteful, especially when people were starving. Others questioned the political motives behind choosing these particular presidents. All white, all male, all emblematic of expansionist policies. Still, the money kept coming. The dream, though expensive and flawed, marched on. For Borglum, every dollar raised was a vote of faith, not just in his monument, but in the American myth it was meant to immortalize. By the late 1930s, Mount Rushmore was taking shape. 3 presidents complete, a 4th underway, and the scaffolding still rising. But then, in March of 1941, the monument's creator, Gutzon Borglum, died suddenly from complications following surgery. He was 73 years old. The man who had dreamed, fought, and blasted this vision into stone was gone, and the project was left without its driving force. Borglum's death sent a wave of uncertainty through the project. He hadn't just been the sculptor. He had been the architect, the fundraiser, the public face, and the visionary who tied it all together. Without him, there was no one who held the same combination of artistic clarity and political savvy. There were blueprints, yes. There were plaster models. But the energy was gone. His son, Lincoln Borglum, took over the project. A quiet, dedicated man who had worked under his father's supervision for years. He was capable and committed, but far less grandiose. While Gutson dreamed of full torsos, inscriptions, and elaborate finishing details, Lincoln took a more practical approach. With time running out and funding tight, he focused on completing Roosevelt's face and securing the site. Then came another blow: World War II. As America turned its attention overseas, priorities shifted. Federal funding was reallocated to the war effort. National sentiment moved from monuments to mobilization. Suddenly, there were more urgent things to build than statues. By October 31st, 1941, the work officially stopped. The carvings were left as they were, incomplete by Borglum's original design, but still monumental. The planned Hall of Records, meant to house American documents and ideals, remained a hidden chamber behind Lincoln's head, unfinished and unused. Only decades later would a sealed repository of historical documents be placed there. And yet, even in its incomplete state, Mount Rushmore stood as a finished idea. 4 presidential faces gazed out over the Black Hills, not quite what Borglum had envisioned, but powerful enough to become an icon. Borglum's death changed the mountain. It froze the dream in place. The monument, once alive with ambition, became solid, static, and silent, much like the stone it was carved from. Today, Mount Rushmore looms as one of the most recognizable landmarks in the United States, a towering symbol of national pride, tourist fascination, and political complexity. To some, it is a breathtaking celebration of American ideals. To others, it is a painful reminder of the cost of empire. Its meaning shifts depending on who you ask. More than 2 million people visit the site each year, gazing up at the 60-foot faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. They come for photographs, for patriotism, and for the sheer awe of the engineering. But beneath the surface, the legacy of Mount Rushmore is far from simple. The monument has become a lightning rod in conversations about history, race, land rights, and national identity. Critics argue that it glorifies presidents who oversaw the expansion of the United States at the direct expense of Native American nations, carving their faces into Lakota sacred land that was seized in violation of federal treaties, is seen by many as a lasting injustice. For the Lakota, Mount Rushmore is not a monument to liberty. It's a scar. At the same time, the monument has been fiercely defended by those who see it as a testament to American perseverance, a product of ingenuity and grit during the Great Depression, and a tribute to leadership. It has appeared in films, advertisements, textbooks, and political rallies, often as a shorthand for America itself. Even presidents have weighed in. Ronald Reagan called it a monument to American exceptionalism. Barack Obama visited the site and acknowledged its beauty while noting its contradictions. Activists have protested there. Tourists have proposed marriage there. It is a place of pilgrimage, both sacred and contested. Meanwhile, the unfinished Hall of Records, tucked behind Lincoln's head, now holds copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and a short biography of Borglum. They rest in a titanium vault, sealed inside a mountain, meant for future civilizations to find. In the end, Mount Rushmore is not just a sculpture. It is a story, carved in granite, edited by history, and debated with every generation. A national myth, towering and incomplete. Just like the country it was meant to represent.